Merci à vous. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour rumeur publique. Je m'appelle Amiel Kornel. Je voudrais remercier Jean-Christophe de m'avoir invité à vous rencontrer, présenter mon livre et surtout avoir une conversation. J'aime beaucoup le fait que ces événements sont intitulés Conversation. Comme vous allez voir, la notion de dialogue est au cœur du sujet aujourd'hui. Et donc je pensais peut-être mettre cette citation ici, Carl Wick, peut-être certains d'entre vous le connaissez, c'est un universitaire à l'University of Michigan aux États-Unis, et qui a fait beaucoup de recherches sur la notion du sens, comment on recherche le sens dans le travail et dans la vie. Meaning. Et il dit, people don't discover sense, they create it, which means they need conversations with others to move towards some shared idea of what meanings are possible. J'aime beaucoup cette citation, surtout parce qu'il y a la notion de conversation et son rôle dans la recherche collective de sens, et aussi parce que je vous avoue que j'ai l'espoir aujourd'hui avec vous de découvrir des sens à mon travail que je ne voyais pas. C'est toujours un plaisir d'en parler avec des gens et échanger parce qu'ils me posent des questions à laquelle je n'avais pas pensé. Ça me permet d'approfondir ce travail. Bon, on va faire ça en franglais. J'espère que ça va aller pour tout le monde. La partie échange, on va le faire en français. Vous m'excusez à l'avance pour mes erreurs grammaticales, du genre surtout. But the slides, if it's okay with you, I'll present in English. I wrote the book in English. The presentation is English. It's easier for me to present in English, unless that's a problem for you. No. English is fine. Okay, so very quickly, something about myself. I have a kind of cross-border story. I live between San Francisco and La Rochelle, two cities by the sea, where I can indulge my love of sailing, and both are very lovely cities. I've spent about 15 years on and off of my adult life living in France. I'm American and British, but have adopted France as one of my homes. I've had a number of professions. Here you see me walking down the Champs-Élysées with a girlfriend. No, you realize that's not the case. This is Jean-Paul Belmondo with Jean Seberg in Au bout de souffle. Why did I choose this picture? It's because she is wearing this t-shirt from the Herald Tribune. And I was a journalist at the International Herald Tribune in Paris for a number of years. Subsequently, I was an entrepreneur. Fortunately, I had some successes, mostly failures, but a few successes. Venture capitalist for more than a decade with the San Francisco office of a company called Spencer Trask & Company. We raised and deployed about $500 million in 22 investments over a decade. Fortunately, a few successes, mostly failures. I defy you to find a venture capitalist who's not obliged to acknowledge the same track record. I've also worked as an advisor. I'm currently affiliated with the innovation consultancy Strategos that may be known to some of you. It was founded by the very eminent Gary Hamel back in the 1990s. And I'm an author, a very proud author, as you can see. My book is not very long, so easy to read, even for millennials. So I'm hoping to have a version in French. But before that, you might want to go ahead and get a copy in English, and I hope you enjoy it. So what is the subject of my book? The topic is what I call venture craft. After 25 years of helping to create startups and new corporate ventures, I had come to a painful observation, which was that despite my best efforts, and more importantly the efforts of people that I was working with, more often than not, we failed. The other observation I had to acknowledge to myself was that even when we had successes, they seemed random. The outcome seemed quite different from the plan we had had when we set out to conquer some new market. And so I challenged myself to do research, which I conducted over a couple of years, to try and answer these two troubling questions for me. Why was it so? And I'm going to share some of the outcome of that research with you today, but I'm also already going to give you the essence, the headline of what I discovered. What I discovered was that for 25 years I had been approaching entrepreneurship and innovation as if it was a science. And in fact, it's not. It's a craft. And as a craft, it's a mix of science and art. I knew a lot about the science, but I knew next to nothing about the art. And so I began inquiring with people like master artisans and others, how did they achieve mastery in their respective crafts? And what I discovered was that skillful improvisation is at the heart of the art of entrepreneurship and innovation. And the good news is that improvisation is something that you can intentionally develop skill at. It's not something like instinct or insight, which are very mysterious qualities of our minds that we don't know if we can depend on. Improvisation is something that happens through action and that you can intentionally improve over time. So let me ask you a question. Do you often improvise when innovating and collaborating? If you think about your average day, do you engage in improvisational activities? Can I see hands from people who say they do, some or much of the time? For those who didn't raise your hands, do you engage in conversations during the day, or do you only conduct monologues?
We have to talk quite a bit.
You talk quite a bit, okay. Do you plan those conversations in advance?
Not always.
No. I suspect that you improvise. You're behaving more as jazz musicians who are jamming, and you just don't think about it that way. So let's see the hands again. How many of you improvise during an average day? A lot more hands. Well, of course you do. Am I blocking the screen? No. Okay, good. Of course you do. But the question then becomes, do you improvise skillfully? And my book is about how you can learn to continuously improve your skill at improvisation. My research I conducted across disciplines, from an investigative reporter, an ocean racing sailor, an Austrian woodworker, eboniste, an urban designer, and a great jazz musician. I found that they all improvised. Improvisation was a critical part of their success. I also did research historically. Napoleon, famous for his coup d'oeil, his ability to look at a battlefield and in an instant understand through the fog and friction of war what the patterns were and where the weak points of his enemy were. Stradivarius. Jacob Davis, who you probably have never heard of, but who invented one of the most famous and enduring consumer products of all times, the blue jeans. And Magellan, the explorer who discovered a route west to the Indies. All of them improvised at critical moments in their innovation journeys. And of course, I looked at many entrepreneurs, and we'll look more closely at some of them today. I spoke to many of them, others I researched, and I found that all of them, if they were successful, had at key points in their journeys improvised. So what is improvisation? One of the reassuring things about this discovery that I made is that improvisation is something that we do naturally. I don't have to prescribe to you to improvise. You do it anyway. You do it ever since childhood. So what is improvisation? It's unplanned innovation that occurs thanks to three things. Persistent dialogue, so we're back to conversation and its importance in innovation. The reassembly of concepts and resources. Tinkering, bricolage in French, is key to innovation, and particularly improvised innovation. And then the exploration of unfamiliar territory, what I call wandering, intentional wandering. L'errance intentionnelle is, I discovered, one of the ways in which improvisation works its way into the work of innovators and entrepreneurs in particular. It's very interesting to me, especially given our theme today of conversations, that dialogue is actually core to all three of these improvisational skills. Of course, conversing is a form of dialogue. It can be musical dialogue. It can be corporeal, kinesthetic dialogue, like these swing dancers. And of course, through language. That comes as no surprise to any of you, that in order to exchange ideas, we need to be good listeners and have open dialogue. But tinkering, bricolage, is also, I argue, a form of dialogue. It's a dialogue between the hands and the tools or the stuff of our craft. Here you see the hands of a potter working the clay and feeling what are the right gestures to make. Here you see the hands of a fine art bookbinder. Happens to be my wife, by the way. These are her hands. She's a restorer of antique books and a bookbinder. And then wandering is also a form of dialogue. It's a dialogue between the map that we've been given or that we've created, perhaps it's in the form of a mental model, and reality, the terrain. When we're wandering, we should be encouraging a constant dialogue between the map and what we're really encountering out in the world. So I would like to broaden our definition of conversation, so that conversation occurs not only with our mouths and our ears, but also with our hands and with our feet, as we're tinkering and as we're exploring. So let's look at some stories. How am I on time? I should... We okay? So this is Jean-Baptiste Reinhardt, more popularly known as Django. Very possibly the greatest improvisational guitarist of all time. He was born into poverty in the 1920s. He's a Manouche, a member of the Roma tribe, what we popularly call gypsies. And he rose to fame in the 20s and 30s as a great musician. Why did he become so famous? Well, for one thing, he created what we would call today a mashup of genres. He was, of course, steeped in the traditions of gypsy music that had evolved among the Roma over centuries as they moved across countries and across continents, absorbing various rhythms and instrumental styles and melodies. But one day it said that he heard the music of Louis Armstrong on a record, and he was smitten by this new form of music that had exploded onto the scene in the United States just before World War II. And he started riffing off of the jazz, and he melded the two. He created a mashup which is called gypsy jazz. He also created a new orchestral format. Today we might say that he created a new business model. He replaced the percussion in the quintet with 3 guitarists who were strumming backup rhythms. But perhaps most interestingly, Django created his very unique sound despite, and maybe also thanks to, a very significant constraint that he had. He was handicapped. A lot of people don't know this, but when he was 18 years old, there was a fire in his roulotte, in his caravan. And he was very seriously injured. And as you can see here, it reduced 2 of the fingers on one of his hands into a stubby claw. The doctor said that he would never play guitar again. But he worked very hard for a couple of years at rehabilitating himself and at developing a new way of performing. And the very distinctive sound of Django can to a large degree be attributed to the way in which he managed this constraint. Let's look at another example. I spoke at length many times with Gérard Penaud. Gérard is the laureat of the Grand Prix de l'Urbanisme in France in 2015. He's an urban designer. And he received this recognition for his work in the city of Nantes. As you may know, Nantes by the 1980s had become a city that was very depressed economically. The shipbuilding industry there had ended. There were high levels of unemployment, and there was very little cultural activity, very little social activity. And there was a decision by Jean-Marc Ayrault, who was the mayor at the time, to renew the city. And he turned to Gérard to help him with that task of improving the city and extending the city. And I asked Gérard, so I know how hard it is just to design a product and to grow a business, but how can you possibly design a city? The amount of uncertainty, the amount of imprévisibilité, impossibility of anticipating the future. After all, it takes at least 15 years to execute an urban renewal project. And then, of course, the city will have a life that will hopefully last for centuries. So how can you, as an urban designer, try to affect an outcome that you have in mind? Also, it became clear that in urban design, you're dealing with many, many different constituencies. You have the city planners who are concerned with regulations. You have engineers. You have architects. You have investors. You have merchants. And of course, you have the people who are going to be living there. And there has to be a collision between the concerns and the goals of each of these constituencies. And I asked him, so how do you manage all of these conflicts? And I was amazed by his answer because he came down to 2 things. One was conversations. He told me that urban design is at its heart a human undertaking. And so it requires relentless devotion to having conversations between all of these constituencies. And so here you see him leading one of those meetings. He said they were often very violent. People were in disagreement about very important things. But he made them realize that they would have to be brought together over and over again in order to resolve their differences. But then the next question I asked him was, so if the goal is to achieve consensus, how do you avoid mediocrity? How do you make sure that by getting everyone to agree, you haven't reduced the plan to its most insipid version? And there, he said, what you need to have is a core premise, what some people might call a vision. In the case of Nantes, he was willing to allow others to influence the outcome in any way as long as they respected this one core premise. And that was simply that the design of the new Nantes had to favor the experience of pedestrians, les piétons. It had to offer an environment that was agreeable and inoffensive to pedestrians. And by having that single premise at the core of his design, then it always became the keystone in debates and discussions and conversations of everyone who was involved. I fear I'm going over in time, so I'm going to skip the next one, which was Isabelle Autissier, the great sailor, first woman to have sailed single-handedly around the world, who's from La Rochelle, where I met her. I want to talk about a couple of entrepreneurs. So this is Joel Schatz. I worked with Joel Schatz for several years because I was part of the founding team at one of the two startups that Joel created. I was the chief operating officer, and this was back in the 1990s. Joel is a very colorful and mischievous character. He's a systems thinker, he's a political activist, and he studied human behavior under Abraham Maslow. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Maslow's positive theory about human motivation and desire. We often talk about the Maslow pyramid. And I think Joel was very influenced by that experience of having studied with Maslow. And he was somebody who very clearly, intentionally wandered across any boundary. No boundary could keep him contained. And he was very resourceful. For his first startup, the one he did before I met him, he had even managed to get George Soros to invest in that venture. Eventually, we were able to sell the company that we created together, Medicode Technologies, for $150 million when we sold it to a company called Interwoven. And it was not easy being Joel's chief operating officer. As I said in my introductory remarks, I was trying to be very scientific. I was trying to be very rigorous. After all, I was the COO. I had to make sure that everything was coming together and moving in a defined direction. While behind me, Joel was being mischievous and kept moving the boundaries of everything we're doing. And he was, it seemed, intentionally creating chaos. And when I went back to him as I was working on the book and asked him about that, I said, didn't you ever worry about the consequences of your behavior during those days? It certainly worried me when I was COO. And he said this, he said, no, it's life. You're just to pay attention to daily signals and you make choices. This is improvisation. This is a statement of improvisation, right? So there are certain rules to improvisation. It has to be in vivo. It has to be in life. You have to be facing reality and not complaining about variability and randomness, but rather embracing them. You have to aim for viability. You know, if any of you are startuppers or have worked with entrepreneurs, you know there's a strong emphasis on scalability. let's scale the business. Well, most startups fail not because they couldn't scale, but they fail because they were not viable. They were not going after a real, authentic opportunity. They were pursuing some fantasy that had been boiled down into a neat value proposition, an elevator pitch, a deck. Maybe some of us, including myself, are guilty of even having helped them to formulate these very simple, clean, coherent narratives. Well, what I realize now is that when there's too much coherence, it must not be true. And so you have to make sure that you're facing reality. And then, as we saw with Gérard Penot, and also with Django, you have to treat constraints not as barriers, but as things that will help move you forward. You have to be relentlessly resourceful and embrace constraints. Thank you very much.